this presentation is to explore literacy as a disciplinary construct. So I'm going to start by providing some framework of key literacy constructs. After that, Taylor is going to demonstrate what these constructs look like in the English discipline. And then she's going to demonstrate a tool that educators could use to help surface the disciplinariness of, or the literacies in the discipline. And then after she's done with that, I'll come back up and I'll give you some questions to think about related to literacy and your discipline, or disciplinary literacy. So this is a huge question that we've been exploring forever. What is literacy? Typically, we think of literacy as reading and writing, and that makes sense. So at one point historically, literacy was being able to speak a certain language in a certain way. Another point, literacy was being able to put a mark, your mark on a document, or to read a certain text. Alabama has the honor of having a pretty interesting literacy test for voting, and that asked individuals some would consider obscure things about American politics. The purpose there was to actually disenfranchise other individuals. So we have this huge history of what counts as literacy. We are just going to broaden that just a little bit today by looking at literacy as the work that we do to make meaning or to make sense of things. So it could be reading, it could be writing, but it could also be some other things. Brian Street is a well-known literacy scholar, and he conceptualized literacy in two ways. He said, first we have what he called the autonomous model of literacy. In that model, literacy has intentionally a capital L and a Y, it's singular. So Street argues that literacy in this model is a technical skill. It's reading words, or saying words in a text, for example. This model of literacy suggests that literacy is decontextualized, that it is always and only one thing, and that if you don't read the way I do, then one of us is wrong. So this is the autonomous model of literacy. Then we have a competing version, literacies with a lowercase l and plural. So here, literacies are situated practice. That means who we are and where we come from and what we want to do and who we think we are and how we want to represent ourselves all influence how and why and for what purposes we make sense of things. You can think of literacies with a lowercase l and plural as families of practices. So think of scripture study for just a minute. So we would each read scripture in a certain way, but if we were to change the context, then we would probably read scripture in a slightly different way. So we would read our scriptures one way at home by ourselves. We may read them a different way in a classroom with our peers. We may read them in a different way with our spouse. We may read them a different way if we're on the bus traveling to class. So that's an example of how literacy can be plural. So we make meaning of our experiences, and in this case the scriptures, in many different ways based on the contextual situatedness of where we are and what we're doing and why we're doing it. So viewing literacies as these families of practices gives us a theoretical entry point into looking at disciplinary literacies. So disciplines are different. I mean, that's what makes disciplines unique. They're unique aspects in terms of how they're different from one another. So the disciplines that we engage in have a whole slew of differences. They have different discourse patterns. I've heard my science colleagues talk, and I can't understand what they're saying. Not just because of the vocabulary, but the actual patterns of talk that they use. Different discourses have different types of genres. They have different text conventions. They have different epistemologies. They even have different ontologies, which to me is very, very interesting. So disciplines differ. They differ in terms of the way they think, their histories, their subcultures. One of my students gave us a really great example. He gave us the example of the word line. And so as a class, we explored this. So line is a word that has different disciplinary meanings based on our disciplinary background. So in English, a line may be a sentence or a phrase, a line of a poem, for example. In art, line is an entirely different thing. In art, it may be an element of artistic expression, or it could also be a tool for representing objects and ideas. If we move on to history, a line can be a political or a geographic boundary, like a line on a map. And historically, those lines can carry tremendous implications. And then my math friends tell me this is funny, but a line in math can be represented with numbers and with letters. So in a nutshell, disciplinary literacy may be the disciplinary appropriate ways that disciplinary experts and novices make sense of things. I'm going to leave things broad here for right now.
Okay. So then we get into what counts as literacy in the English discipline. And the two main things that we found through the analysis of the interviews was that one, that the relationship, that experts view the literacy as a student-to-text relationship, and that this is multidimensional. And two, that the relationship is developed by reading, writing, and talking about the text. And the student-to-text relationship can be divided into three different dimensions: the cognitive, affective, and edifying, which explore the mental, emotional, and self and social improvement aspects of the student-to-text relationship. So the first dimension focuses on the mental aspects of the relationship, so between the reader and the text. And experts viewed the cognitive dimension as an aspect of literacy in terms of teaching their students the text by using relationship language such as interpreting, analyzing, critiquing the text, and going beyond the surface level. A representative quote by one expert said that it's about being able to go beyond the literal meaning of a text and to be able to engage in the nuances and contextual meanings that is afforded by in-depth analysis and critical thinking, and to not just get the students to understand what is happening, but to process and think and have a critical response to it. And the second dimension focuses on the emotional qualities of the student-to-text relationship, so how the text makes the student feel, or how the students feel about the text. And one expert said that they approach text with enthusiasm because they know that texts have the power to challenge and change the way a person thinks. And this dimension includes the development of their empathy, and as one expert reported, that the pursuit of literature is a highly spiritual pursuit, or that they are much less concerned about getting the text than with the experience they are having when reading it. And experts often place the cognitive and affective dimensions in contrast to each other, and they said that the affective may be more important than the cognitive. And one expert said, "The way I approach a text in my discipline as something that's going to change the way I feel about something, but not necessarily the way I think about something." And the knowledge that's gained in the English discipline is often difficult to quantify and focuses much more on how the text makes you feel. And the effectiveness of reading a text may be a quality specific to the English discipline. Other disciplines may not put as much emphasis or weight on how a text makes a reader feel than the English discipline does. And the third dimension focuses on improving oneself in relation to the rest of society and your ability to live a good life. A representative quote by one expert said, "A text moves people to change their lives in some way, and that they hope their students can get something meaningful out of it, and that it will make their life better, and that they will make better decisions to live their life better." Literacy is to make the reader better, happier, improves how the reader views the world, and the reader's relationship with others. And then we go into the second theme, which is how to develop students' literacies in your discipline. When experts were asked what literacy is in the English discipline and how it's developed, one expert summarized how he helps the students develop the student-to-text relationship, and the response was, I make them read, I make them write, and I make them talk about it. The experts talk a lot about reading the text and that they see reading more as a process than an act. So pay close attention to the verbs that I use in this next quote. One expert discussed this process of reading as you have to process and communicate effectively, read and understand the implications of what you read, and then effectively analyze and respond to, make a judgment or statement about what you just read, and then participate in the conversation about it. In addition to reading the text, it continues by talking about the text through discussion, asking questions, and analysis. And in regards to talking to develop the student-to-text relationship, there is a little bit of conflicting data. All experts said that talk is crucial to this relationship, but how the experts view their role in this relationship varies. Some saw their role as talking to the students about the text, some experts teach their students to ask the right questions, and others see themselves facilitating the talk student to student. One expert actually said that the worst thing that he could do was talk to the student about the text. And this is kind of an uncommon view of facilitating talk in this relationship, because this expert viewed that talking to the student was detrimental to developing this student-to-text relationship. He felt that he was getting in the way of them developing it. And as students are able to talk about the text, experts suggest that they are able to contribute to the criticism of the text. And this is important because the talk allows them to engage in this relationship, and the nature of the relationship is relational to the criticism of the text. And the talk facilitates this relationship, which is meaning-making in the discipline. Students and text have this tight relationship, so when students can negotiate a text in a relationship way, which is literacy in the English discipline, when they're able to contribute to the criticism of the text, then they have a stronger relationship with the text, and they become more grounded or secure in the English discipline. And then the experts talk much less about writing, other than to have their students write critical responses to the text, and place more emphasis on talking and reading the text. But we felt that it was important to include in this presentation because writing is an important meaning-making process. And we see that writing maybe needs further exploration. But for me, as an English major, I feel like writing is important, an important meaning-making process, because writing formulates opinions, it clarifies and challenges understanding of the text, it's knowledge production, and because writing in English allows individuals to do these things, it can put the student and text in a much closer relationship to one another. And writing is another way to construct meaning or for students to engage with the text. Okay, so I'm going to demonstrate a Think-Aloud, but what is a Think-Aloud? Essentially, it's a method that can be useful for disciplinary experts to show their students how they are making meaning in that with disciplinary text. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read the text out loud how I normally would, but I'm going to verbalize my thinking so that you guys can see how my mind is working as I'm engaged with the text. My mistress' eyes are nothing like the sun, by William Shakespeare. Okay. William Shakespeare. He's always pretty difficult. I know that he's written As You Like It, 12th Night. And this one, I remember this is kind of, it's a popular sonnet, but I don't remember which number. But I think it's the fourth. Okay, so I'll go ahead and get started. My mistress, who is the speaker? And mistress, that's kind of a negative connotation now, but I wonder if it had a different meaning back then. Maybe it's affectionate. My mistress' eyes are nothing like the sun. It kind of seems negative. Isn't this supposed to be a love poem though? I'll keep reading. Coral is far more red than her lips red. Well, when I think of a beautiful woman, I think that their lips would have red and white. I wonder why the speaker chose this word. What does that mean? But then he says red and white, so I wonder if that has something to do with that. I might have to look that up. Red and white. Maybe a mixture, something. Okay, so I'll go ahead and stop there for time. Okay. So, just going through with what I did in the Think-Aloud, some of the things I did to make sense of the poem in a disciplinary way, appropriate way, was that I made predictions saying like, I predict, or I visualized what was going on in the poem. I'm picturing this, or I made questions. I said, I wonder about this, or I made connections. This reminds me of so-and-so, or I identified problems. I said, I'm not so sure about this. And then I used fix-ups, which meant just, I'll reread this, or I might need outside help on this part. So those are some strategies that I was able to use to get through the text in a disciplinary and appropriate way.
I want to draw attention to a couple of the things that Taylor did when she was reading. She also drew from her disciplinary knowledge. She's an English major, so before she began, she drew from what she understood of Shakespeare, her experiences with him and with his work. She also did a really interesting thing insofar as she situated the text historically. Based on my knowledge of this historical context, that then I think that this might be occurring, or I wonder why he's doing this instead of this. She also made personal connections to the text. I would, the Medusa line, where she said, oh, I wouldn't like to be compared to a person like this. This was just a brief example that was loaded with specific ways that Taylor, as an English major, makes sense of an English text or a disciplinary specific text. Every discipline has texts that they privilege. They have different ways of engaging with these texts. What we're trying to do is surface some of those ways or some of those literacies. Because as disciplinary experts, most of the people sitting in this room have kind of figured out how to do these things. Oftentimes, that expertness or the expert meaning-makingness remains in the expert, and the research tells us that very few disciplinary novices are explicitly taught how to make sense of disciplinary texts. So here are some things that, some questions that we think might be useful just to reflect on for a moment. What does it mean in my discipline to learn? How do I know in my discipline that learning has actually occurred? Which literacy practices or ways of making meaning of texts are privileged in my discipline? And are those same ways privileged in the classes that I teach? And this is a big one. What counts as texts in my discipline? I push my students to think of a rock as a text. And most of them say, no, that's not. And they're right. But I usually have a biology student there who says, wait a second. I can read that. And so he reads it for us. And I don't know the language because that escapes me. But he can look at it and say, oh, this rock has these qualities, has these striations, so it must be this. Every discipline has different things that count as texts. To make sense of them, the reader and the text have to come into a relationship with one another. I can't read most of the authentic biological texts. And this is another big one. Who are my students? And what do they bring with them to the discipline and to the meaning-making processes privileged in the discipline? What vocabularies do they have? What background knowledge do they have? What interests do they have? How much do they not know about the discipline? And then we have this one. How can I make my disciplinary literacy practices more explicit for my students? In other words, how can I, as a disciplinary expert, unlock science or history or English or art or any of the disciplines. So these are some questions to think about. In conclusion, Taylor and I would like to make the case that disciplines have literacies that are unique to them, and that we can do things to demystify those literacies or those meaning-making practices for the students that we teach.